Jake Martinez pushed his empty coffee cup away and rubbed his tired eyes. The cargo run from the outer colonies had taken 3 weeks, and he felt every day of it in his bones. Through the massive window of Luna Station's Café, Earth hung like a blue marble against the black of space. He had been staring at it for 20 minutes, trying to decide if he had enough energy to make it back to his ship. The café buzzed with the usual morning crowd. Miners grabbed quick breakfasts before heading to the asteroid fields. Traders argued over shipping rates at corner tables. Station workers complained about broken air recyclers and overtime shifts. Jake liked this place because it felt normal. No fancy decorations or expensive food. Just regular people doing regular jobs, trying to make a living in the big, empty galaxy. He was about to leave when an old woman approached his table. She had silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and wore a plain gray jumpsuit like the kind station workers used. Her face had the kind of lines that came from years of hard work, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Would you mind if I sat here?" All the other tables seemed to be taken. Jake looked around. The cafe was busy, but not packed. There were a few empty seats scattered around. Still, he had been raised to be polite. To his elders, "Sure, no problem," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. The woman sat down with a small smile. "Thank you. I'm Helen." "Jake," he replied. "Jake Martinez." The serving droid rolled over on its worn wheels. "What can I get you today?" it asked in its cheerful mechanical voice. "Just black coffee, please," Helen said. Jake ordered another cup. For himself, he figured he might as well be social, since he had company. The woman seemed nice enough, and it beat sitting alone feeling sorry for himself. "Beautiful view," Helen said, nodding toward the window where Earth slowly turned below. "Them? Yeah, it never gets old," Jake agreed. "I've been running cargo routes for 12 years, and I still like looking at it when I'm up here." "You're a pilot, then? Independent cargo hauler?" "Nothing fancy, just moving stuff from point A to point B." Jake shrugged. "Not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. Most of the time, anyway." Helen tilted her head slightly. "Problems with work? Just the usual stuff. Bureaucrats making everything complicated, shipping delays. Clients who think they can change the deal after you've already loaded their cargo." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sometimes I wonder why I don't just get a nice safe job on a planet somewhere." "But you don't?" Helen observed. "No, I don't. I guess I like being my own boss, even when it means eating cheap station food and sleeping in a cargo hold half the time." The droid brought their coffee, Helen rapped. Her hands around the cup and took a sip. "Good coffee," she said. "Best on the station," Jake replied. "Which isn't saying much, but it's better than the recycled stuff I brew on my ship." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the morning crowd. A group of miners was arguing loudly about asteroid mining rights. Traders were shaking hands over what looked like a big deal. A tired-looking station worker was falling asleep over his breakfast. "Busy place," Helen said. "Luna Station's one of the main hubs for intersystem trade. People come here from all over." Jake gestured around the cafe. "Most of these folks work harder than the big corporate executives, but they're the ones who make the galaxy run." "You sound like you have strong opinions about that." Jake felt his cheeks warm. "Sorry, I didn't mean to get political. It's just frustrating sometimes, you know. The little guys do all the work while the big powers play their games." "Don't apologize," Helen said. "It's refreshing to hear someone speak honestly about their work." Jake studied her face. There was something about the way she listened that made him want to keep talking. Most people just waited for their turn to speak, but Helen seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. "What about you?" he asked. "What kind of work do you do?" Helen paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "I coordinate various business interests, help resolve disputes between different parties. Nothing as exciting as piloting a ship across the galaxy. Sounds important, though. The galaxy needs people who can solve problems." "Sometimes I wonder if I'm solving the right problems," Helen said quietly. Jake looked at her more closely. Despite her simple clothes and humble manner, there was something about her that suggested she was more than just another station worker. The way she sat, the careful way she spoke, even the way other people in the cafe seemed to unconsciously avoid their corner of the room. "You seem like someone who cares about doing the right thing," Jake said. That's more than you can say. For most people in positions of responsibility, Helen's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. What makes you think I'm in a position of responsibility? Jake shrugged. Just a feeling. You ask good questions and you listen like someone who's used to making decisions that matter. And you speak like someone who understands the weight of responsibility, even if you claim to be just a cargo pilot. They looked at each other across the small table. Jake felt like there was more to this conversation than simple small talk, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. I've got a daughter, Jake said, changing the subject. Lucy. She's studying xenobiology at Mars University. It's the smartest kid you've ever met. She's going to do amazing things someday. Helen's expression softened. You must be very proud. More than I can say. She's everything I could have hoped for and more. Sometimes I can't believe I had anything to do with raising someone that incredible. Children have a way of surprising us, Helen said. They see possibilities we never imagined. Jake nodded. Lucy's always been like that, even when she was little. She'd ask questions that made me think about things in new ways. Like why we can't all just get along, you know? Why there have to be wars and trade disputes and all the rest of it. And what did you tell her? That most people are good, but sometimes good people disagree about how to solve problems. And sometimes people who aren't so good get into positions where they can cause trouble for everyone else. Helen set down her coffee cup and looked out at Earth again. Do you really believe that most people are good? I do, Jake said, without hesitation. I've been to dozens of worlds dealt with. Humans and aliens of every kind. Sure, there are bad ones, but most folks just want to live their lives in peace, take care of their families, maybe make things a little better for their kids. Even with all the problems you mentioned, the bureaucrats and the powerful people playing games? Jake considered this. I think even most of them started out wanting to do good. Power just has a way of making people forget what it's like to be on the receiving end of their decisions. Helen was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. What would you do if you had that kind of power? Ability to change things on a large scale? Jake laughed. I'd probably mess it up completely. But I guess I'd try to remember what it's like to be sitting in a cafe wondering if you can afford to help your kid with school fees. I'd want to make sure that whatever decisions I made, they helped people like the ones in this room. Helen nodded slowly. That's a good answer. What about you? If you could change anything about how the galaxy works, what would it be? Helen was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if he had asked the wrong question. Finally, she said, I think I'd want to have more conversations like this one. Real conversations with real people about what matters to them. Jake smiled. That sounds like a good place to start. Outside the cafe window, Earth continued its slow rotation, and the morning crowd began to thin as people headed off to their jobs. Jake found himself hoping that Helen wouldn't have to leave anytime soon. It had been a long time since he'd had such an interesting conversation with a stranger. The serving droid brought them fresh coffee without being asked. Jake noticed that it moved more quietly around their table than it did with other customers, but he pushed the thought away. Station droids were programmed to be polite to everyone. Tell me more about your cargo routes, Helen said, settling back in her chair. It must be interesting, seeing so many different worlds. Jake warmed to the subject. It has its moments. Last month, I was hauling mining equipment to Kepler Station. The dock supervisor there was this huge alien with tentacles instead of arms. Looked scary as anything, but he turned out to be the nicest guy you could meet. Helped me load the heavy stuff personally and invited me to dinner with his family. But not all your experiences are so pleasant. Oh no, definitely not. Jake laughed and shook his head. 2 weeks ago, I had a client on New Geneva who decided he wanted to change our agreement after I'd already loaded his cargo. Wanted me to make an extra stop that would have cost me 3 days and a tank of fuel, but he didn't want to pay extra for it. Helen leaned forward slightly. How did you handle that? I had to stand my ground. I told him a deal was a deal, and if he wanted changes, we'd need to renegotiate the price. He threatened to report me to the Traders Guild, said he had connections. Jake shrugged. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's bluffing, and was he? Completely turned out. He owed money all over that system. His connections were mostly people trying to collect debts from him. Helen nodded thoughtfully. I've dealt with people like that in my own work. They use threats and borrowed authority because they don't have any real power of their own. Jake studied her face. What kind of disputes do you handle? Mind me asking? Helen was quiet for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. Various kinds? Sometimes it's trade disagreements between different groups. Sometimes it's more complex political situations. The work requires a lot of travel and dealing with people who have very different ways of seeing things. Hey, that sounds stressful. Do you ever get tired of it? All the arguing and negotiating? A shadow crossed Helen's face. More than you might think. Sometimes I wonder if I'm making things better or just moving problems around from one place to another. Jake heard something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. You sound like someone who's been doing important work for a long time. The kind of work that weighs on you. Yes, Helen said simply. It does weigh on me. They sat in silence for a moment. Jake found himself wanting to comfort this woman. He barely knew. There was something lonely about her, despite her calm manner. I used to worry about that too, Jake said. Whether what I was doing mattered. I mean, I'm just moving cargo from one place to another. How important can that be? What changed your mind? Lucy, mostly, my daughter. She pointed out that everything people need to live their lives has to get from where it's made to where it's needed. Food, medicine, tools, books, toys for kids. Someone has to move all that stuff. And if we didn't do our jobs, people would suffer. Helen tilted her head. She sounds wise. She gets that from her mother. I just do the flying. Jake's smile faded a little. Lucy's mom died when she was 12. Cancer that spread too fast for the doctors to stop. Since then, it's just been me and Lucy figuring things out together. I'm sorry for your loss. Thanks. It was hard, but Lucy helped me through it as much as I helped her, maybe more. Took a sip of his coffee. She's the reason I keep working so hard. Everything I do is to make sure she has the chances I never had. Helen was quiet for another long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. You mentioned that? She asks difficult questions about why people can't get along. All the time. Even now that she's older, she still wants to understand why there's so much conflict in the galaxy. Wars, trade disputes, species that won't talk to each other. She thinks if everyone just sat down and talked honestly about what they needed, most problems could be solved. Do you agree with her? Jake considered this. Mostly, yeah. I mean, look at us. We're strangers from who knows where, but we're having a perfectly normal conversation. We're not trying to cheat each other or start a fight. We're just talking. Nodded slowly. But what about when the stakes are higher? When the decisions affect millions of people, I think that's when it becomes even more important to talk to regular people. The bigger the decision, the more you need to understand how it's going to affect folks like us. Jake gestured around the cafe. Every person in this room has a family, dreams, problems they're trying to solve. If the people making big decisions forget that, they stop making good choices. Even if talking takes longer than just making the decision and moving on, especially then, my dad used to say that if you don't have time to do something right the first time, when are you going to? Find time to fix it later? Helen smiled for the first time since they'd started talking. It transformed her face, making her look younger and less burdened. Your father sounds like a smart man. He was a maintenance worker on an orbital station. He's never made much money. But he knew how to fix things that were broken, not just machines either. He had a way of helping people work through their problems. Is he still alive? No, he passed 5 years ago. Heart attack while he was working on a faulty air recycler. Saved the whole station, but it cost him his life. Jake's voice caught slightly. He would have been so proud of Lucy. She's everything he believed people could be. Helen reached across the table and briefly touched Jake's hand. I'm sure he would be proud of you too. You're carrying on his values. Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest. Thanks. That means a lot, coming from someone who obviously understands responsibility. What makes you think I understand responsibility? Studied her face again. The way you listen, the questions you ask. You're not just making conversation. You're trying to understand something important. Helen was quiet for a long moment. What do you think I'm trying to understand? How to make better decisions? Maybe. How to stay connected to the people your choices affect? Jake shrugged. I could be completely wrong. It's just a feeling. You're not wrong, Helen said quietly. Around them, the lunch crowd was starting to filter in. Jake noticed that people seemed to naturally avoid the tables near theirs, but he couldn't figure out why. The cafe wasn't that crowded yet. Can I ask you something? Jake said. Of course. Do you ever feel lonely in your work? Like you can't really talk to people about what you're dealing with? Helen looked startled by the question. Why do you ask that? You just seem like someone who carries a lot on your shoulders. And earlier, when you talked about wondering if you're solving the right problems, you sounded like someone who doesn't have many people to talk through those doubts with. Helen stared at him for a long moment. Most people in my position don't discuss their uncertainties with others. That sounds lonely, it is, Helen admitted. More than I usually allow myself to think about. Jake leaned back in his chair. Well, for what it's worth, someone who worries about whether they're making the right choices is probably the kind of person who can be trusted to make important decisions. The ones you have to worry about are the people who never doubt themselves. Helen's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. That's an interesting perspective. Lucy taught me that. She said the smartest people she knows are the ones who ask the most questions, especially about their own ideas. Your daughter really is wise. She gets it from her grandfather. He always said that being certain about everything was just another way of being wrong about most things. Helen laughed, and the sound was genuinely warm. I would have liked to meet your father. He would have liked you too. He had a soft spot for people who were trying to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Jake's communicator chimed softly. He glanced at it and saw a message from the dock supervisor. His next cargo pickup had been moved up by 6 hours, which meant he'd have to cut this conversation short. Problem? Helen asked, noticing his expression. Not a problem exactly. A schedule change. Looks like I'll need to head out sooner than I expected. That's too bad. I've been enjoying our conversation. Me too, Jake said, and realized he meant it. I can't remember the last time I talked to someone who really listened like you do. Helen smiled again. The feeling is mutual. As Jake gathered his things, he found himself hoping their paths would cross again. There was something about Helen that made him want to continue their conversation. To learn more about the woman behind the careful words and thoughtful questions, he had no idea. That his simple honesty and genuine concern had already begun to change the course of galactic history. Jake checked his communicator again and sighed. Actually, it looks like my pickup got delayed again. Like some kind of paperwork issue at the cargo office. He looked up at Helen with a smile. Guess I have more time after all, if you don't mind. The company. I'd like that very much, Helen said, and Jake could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. The serving droid appeared again, refilling their coffee cups without being asked. Jake noticed that it moved almost silently around their table, unlike its usual clanking approach to other customers. He was starting to wonder about Helen more and more. You mentioned your work involves resolving disputes, Jake said, settling back into his chair. That must give you a unique view of how the galaxy works. Helen nodded slowly. It does. I see a lot of conflicts that could be avoided if people just talk to each other honestly from the beginning. That's what I've never understood about the big powers, Jake said, his voice growing more animated. The hegemony, the Trade Federation, all those shadowy groups that seem to control everything from behind the scenes. They spend so much time playing political games that they forget there are real people affected by their decisions. Helen's expression became very still. What do you think they should do differently? Jake leaned forward, warming to his subject. They should get out of their fancy offices and talk to regular folks. Spend time in places like this cafe, listening to what people actually need instead of what they think people need.
Already.
And you believe that would change their decisions? I have to believe that, Jake said earnestly. I mean, most of these powerful people started out as regular citizens, right? They must have families, friends, people they care about. If they remembered what it was like to worry about paying bills or keeping their kids safe, they'd make better choices. Helen was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. When she looked up, there was something different in her eyes. What if some of these powerful people have been in their positions for so long that they've forgotten what it's like to be powerless? Then they need to remember, Jake said without hesitation. That's their responsibility. Power isn't just about making decisions. It's about understanding the weight of those decisions on other people's lives, even if remembering is painful, even if it means questioning everything they've done. Jake studied Helen's face. There was something deeply personal in her questions, as if she wasn't asking hypothetically, especially then. My dad used to say that if you're not willing to question your own actions, you're not worthy of the power to take them. Helen's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Your father sounds like he understood something that many people in positions of authority never learn. He understood that power should serve people, not the other way around. Jake paused, then added quietly. He also understood that the people who worry most about using power correctly are usually the ones who deserve to have it. And what about the ones who are confident they're always right? Those are the dangerous ones, Jake said immediately. The ones who never doubt themselves, who think their position gives them the right to make decisions without considering the consequences for others. They're the ones who cause most of the galaxy's problems. Helen was silent for a long time, looking out at Earth as it slowly rotated below them. The cafe had grown quieter as the lunch crowd thinned out, leaving mostly a few scattered conversations and the soft hum of the air recyclers. Jake, Helen said finally, what would you do if you discovered that someone you were talking to was one of those powerful people? Someone who had made decisions that affected millions of lives. Jake tilted his head, studying her face. Are we still talking hypothetically? Helen met his eyes directly. What if we weren't? Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but not from fear. From understanding. The way other customers avoided their area. The unusual behavior of the serving droid. The careful way Helen chose her words. Depth of knowledge she showed about galactic politics. You want to know if they were willing to listen, Jake said slowly. If they cared about the people their decisions affected. If they were trying to do better. And if they were, then I'd try to help them understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of those decisions. Not in an angry way, but honestly. Because maybe they need to hear it from someone who doesn't want anything from them except for them to be better. Helen's eyes glistened slightly. Even if some of their past decisions had caused harm, Jake thought about this carefully. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether they learn from them and try to do better. Someone who's willing to question their own actions and listen to people they've affected, that's someone who might be worth trusting. You have a lot of faith in people's ability to change. I have to, Jake said simply. If I didn't believe people could become better than they were, what would be the point of anything? My daughter's going to inherit whatever kind of galaxy we leave behind. I want it to be one where powerful people remember their humanity. Helen was quiet for another long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. What if I told you that I coordinate more than just business disputes? That my work affects the lives of billions of people across hundreds of worlds? Jake's heart began to beat faster, but he kept his voice steady. Then I'd say, you have the most important job in the galaxy. I'd hope you had people around you who could help you remember why that job matters. Most people in my position surround themselves with advisors who tell them what they want to hear. It sounds lonely and dangerous. It is both of those things. Jake leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The unusual deference of the station staff. It's the way Helen listened with the intensity of someone used to making life-changing decisions. The depth of her questions about power and responsibility. Helen, he said carefully, who are you really? Helen looked at him for a long moment, then out at the stars beyond Earth. I have many names across the galaxy. Most people know me as Zephyr Ascending. Jake felt the air leave his lungs. He had heard that name whispered in spaceports and trading posts across the galaxy, spoken with fear and awe by pilots, traders, and station workers. The most powerful being in known space. The one who controlled fleets that could destroy star systems and economic networks that spanned thousands of worlds. His first instinct wasn't to run or to bow or to apologize for his casual manner. His first thought was concern for the lonely, Woman sitting across from him. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Helen looked startled. I'm sorry. You just told me you're the most powerful person in the galaxy. And you look like you're carrying the weight of the universe on your shoulders. Are you okay? Helen stared at him for a long moment, then did something she hadn't done in decades. She began to cry. Not sobbing, just quiet tears running down her cheeks as she looked at this cargo pilot who had responded to her revelation with concern for her well-being rather than fear for his own safety. No, she said quietly. I don't think I am okay. I haven't been okay for a very long time. Jake reached across the table and gently took her hand. What can I do to help? Helen squeezed his hand gratefully. Now, you've already done more than you know. You've reminded me of something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? What it feels like to be human? They sat in silence for a moment. The most powerful being in the galaxy and a simple cargo pilot connected by the basic human need for understanding and compassion. I have a question, Jake said finally. Ask it. If you can control fleets and reshape economies, why are you sitting in a cafe on Luna Station talking to a nobody like me? Helen smiled through her tears. 'Cause you're not a nobody, Jake Martinez. You're exactly the kind of person I need to remember exists. Someone who sees power as responsibility instead of privilege. Someone who cares more about doing right than being right. Jake squeezed her hand gently. And you're exactly the kind of powerful person the galaxy needs. Someone who questions themselves and listens to people like me. How can you be so sure? Because you're here, Jake said simply. Because instead of ruling from some distant throne, you're sitting in a cafe trying to understand what your decisions mean to ordinary people. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Helen wiped her eyes with her free hand. I don't deserve your faith in me. Maybe not, Jake said, with a gentle smile. But you're going to get it anyway. That's what friends do. Friends. If you want to be. I know you're busy running the galaxy and all, but if you ever need someone to remind you why your job matters, I'll be here, Helen smiled back. And for the first time in centuries, she felt like she wasn't carrying her burden alone. Helen wiped the last of her tears away and looked at Jake with something like wonder. In 3,000 years, no one has ever asked me if I was okay after learning who I am. 3,000 years? Jake's eyes widened. How long have you been in charge of things? Long enough to forget what it was like to be anything else, Helen said quietly. Long enough to make more mistakes than I can count. Jake's communicator chimed, interrupting the moment. He glanced at it, and his face fell. The message was from his shipping company, and it wasn't good news. What's wrong? Helen asked, noticing his expression immediately. Jake set the device down. With a heavy sigh, my next contract just got canceled. Some kind of political situation in the Centauri sector. Trade routes are being shut down while the powers that be figure out their latest disagreement. How does that affect you? No work? For at least 3 weeks, maybe longer. Jake ran his hand through his hair. And I was counting on that money. Lucy's tuition payment is due next month, and without this job, I'm not going to be able to help her. Helen leaned forward. Tell me more about this situation in Centauri. Same old story. 2 different factions arguing over mining rights, and instead of talking it out, they're using trade blockades to hurt each other. Meanwhile, independent pilots like me get caught in the middle. Jake's voice carried frustration and worry. The big powers play their games and regular people pay the price. Helen was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. What would you do if you had the power to fix this situation? Right now, today. Jake looked at her strangely. That's an odd question to ask someone who just told you he can't even afford his daughter's school fees. Humor me. Jake considered it seriously. I'd get both sides in a room and make them talk to each other like adults. I'd remind them that their fight is hurting thousands of innocent people who just want to make a living. I'd make sure any agreement they reached protected the little guys, not just the big corporations. And if they refused to negotiate, then I'd find ways to encourage them. Cut off their funding, maybe. Make it clear that acting like children has consequences. Jake shrugged. But that's fantasy. People like me don't get to tell the powerful what to do. Helen studied his face carefully. What if that wasn't fantasy? What if someone could actually make those things happen? Then they should do it, Jake said, without hesitation. Anyone with that kind of power has a responsibility to use it for more than their own benefit. Helen nodded slowly, then did something that would have shocked anyone who knew her true identity. She closed her eyes and began speaking in a language Jake didn't recognize. Her voice was quiet but carried an authority that made the air around them seem to vibrate. Jake watched in fascination as Helen spoke for nearly a minute in what sounded like commands or instructions. When she opened her eyes, she looked directly at him. What was that? Jake asked. I was taking your advice, Helen said simply. Jake's communicator chimed again. He looked at it with confusion, then amazement. This can't be right. What does it say the Centauri situation has been resolved? Both sides have agreed to binding arbitration, and all trade routes are reopening immediately. Jake stared at the screen. My contract is back on, with a bonus for the inconvenience. He looked up at Helen, pieces of understanding clicking into place. That wasn't a coincidence, was it? No, it wasn't. Jake set his communicator down carefully. You actually did it. You ended a conflict that was affecting thousands of people, just like that. Just like you suggested, Helen said. Both factions are now in negotiation rooms with neutral arbitrators. Their funding for military actions has been frozen until they reach a peaceful agreement. New trade protection laws are being drafted. To prevent independent pilots from being caught in future disputes, Jake stared at her in amazement. How? I have resources at my disposal. People who answer when I call. Systems that respond to my commands. Helen's voice carried a weight that Jake was only beginning to understand. The question is whether I use those resources wisely. But you just solved a major crisis in a matter of minutes. How is that not wise? Helen looked troubled. Because I've had the power to do that for weeks, Jake. The Centauri situation has been developing for over a month. I could have ended it at any time, but I was focused on other things. Bigger pictures, longer-term strategies. Jake felt a chill as the full implications hit him. How many people suffered while you were focused on bigger pictures? Too many, Helen said quietly. Pilots like you who lost work, families who couldn't get supplies they needed, children who went hungry because food shipments were delayed. She looked out at Earth again. I told myself that some short-term suffering was acceptable if it led to better long-term stability. And now I'm wondering how many times I've made that calculation. How many real people I've treated as acceptable losses in pursuit of abstract goals. Jake reached across the table and took her hand again. The fact that you're asking that question means you're not beyond redemption. You really believe that? I have to. If someone with your power can't change and grow, then the rest of us are doomed. Jake squeezed her hand gently. But I think you can. The woman who ended that conflict because it was the right thing to do, she's someone worth believing in. Helen looked down at their joined hands. I've been so isolated for so long, Jake. Making decisions that affect billions of lives, but never really understanding what those decisions mean to individuals. I've become exactly what you described earlier. Someone too removed from regular people's struggles. So get closer. How? Jake smiled. Keep having conversations like this one. Find more people who will tell you the truth about how your decisions affect them. Don't just listen to advisors who tell you what you want to hear. Most people are too intimidated to give me honest feedback. Then don't tell them who you are. Right away, sit in cafes and talk to cargo pilots. Visit markets and listen to shopkeepers. Go to schools and hear what teachers are worried about. Jake's eyes lit up with the idea. Experience the galaxy the way regular people do. Helen considered this. That would require me to step away from my usual responsibilities. Would that be so bad? How much of your time is spent on things that only you can do versus things that you do because you've always done them? Helen was quiet for a long moment. More of the latter than I care to admit. And delegate some of those things. Trust other people to handle the day-to-day stuff while you focus on the decisions that really matter. Jake's communicator chimed. A third time, This time, the message made him break into a huge smile. "What now?" Helen asked. "Lucy got a scholarship. A full scholarship to continue her xenobiology studies." Jake looked up at Helen with tears in his eyes. "This says it's from the Galactic Education Foundation for students whose families have been affected by trade disruptions." Helen smiled. "That foundation was established about 10 minutes ago." Jake laughed and shook his head. "You're going to take some getting used to. Are you willing to try?" "What do you mean?" Helen leaned forward, her expression serious. "I want to offer you something, Jake. Not a job exactly, but a partnership. I need people around me who can help me remember what my decisions mean to. Ordinary citizens. People who aren't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. You want me to be some kind of advisor?" "I want you to be my friend," Helen said simply. "Someone I can talk to honestly about the weight of power and the responsibility that comes with it. Someone who will help me stay connected to the people I'm supposed to serve." Jake thought about this carefully. "Can I keep flying cargo runs?" "I'd insist on it. The moment you stop being a working pilot is the moment you stop being useful to me in this role. And Lucy, her education is secure regardless of your answer." "That's not a bribe, Jake. It's the right thing to do." Jake looked out at Earth, then back at the most powerful being in the galaxy who was asking for his friendship and guidance. It was the strangest job offer he'd ever received, but also the most important. "Okay," he said finally. "But I have conditions. Name them." "We keep having conversations like this one. Real conversations, not formal briefings. And when I tell you you're wrong about something, you promise to listen." Helen smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Deal." As they shook hands, Jake realized that his simple life as a cargo pilot was about to become much more complicated. But looking at Helen's hopeful expression, he thought it might also become much more meaningful. 2 hours later, the cafe had emptied out except for Jake and Helen. The artificial evening cycle was beginning on Luna Station. Earth below them showed the lights of cities coming alive on the night side of the planet. Jake had spent the time asking Helen questions about her life, her responsibilities, and the weight of power she carried. With each answer, he understood more about the loneliness and burden she had lived with for centuries. "I still can't quite believe this is real," Jake said, shaking his head. "This morning I was just a tired cargo pilot drinking coffee. Now, having dinner with the most powerful person in the galaxy." Helen smiled. "You're still a tired cargo pilot drinking coffee? That hasn't changed. Everything else has, though." Jake gestured around the empty cafe. "I'm guessing those security teams I can't see are the reason we have this place to ourselves now." "They're very good at staying invisible," Helen admitted. "But yes, they're there. I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable. It's strange, but I understand why it's necessary." Jake leaned back in his chair. "What I don't understand is how you've managed to stay sane all these years, carrying that much responsibility alone." Helen was quiet for a moment.
A fiber from the I'm
This conversation with you is the first time in decades that I've felt like myself, instead of just a collection of duties and decisions. That's what worries me about your offer, Jake said honestly. What if talking to me changes how you do your job? What if me keeping you grounded interferes with some important decision you need to make? Then I'll make a more human decision instead of a purely strategic one, Helen replied. Jake, for 3,000 years I've been making choices based on data, projections, and long-term planning. Some of those choices have been good, but many have caused unnecessary suffering because I forgot that statistics represent real people with real lives. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Lucy always says that numbers can lie if you're not careful about what they're measuring. Right. She's right. I've been measuring efficiency, stability, and economic growth. But I haven't been measuring happiness, hope, or human dignity. Helen looked out at Earth again. Your friend Helen, who coordinates business disputes, might have understood those things. Zephyrin ascending, forgot them somewhere along the way. So be Helen more often, Jake suggested. Keep the power, but remember the person who wields it. Helen's communicator, a device far more advanced than Jake's simple unit, chimed softly. She glanced at it and frowned slightly. Problem? Jake asked. My staff is wondering about some of the orders I've been issuing today. Apparently, my instructions regarding the Centauri situation and several other matters are quite different from my usual approach. Are they questioning your decisions? They're questioning my mental state, Helen said with a wry smile. In the past 4 hours, I've resolved 3 major conflicts through negotiation instead of economic pressure, established a new education fund, and restructured trade protection laws. My advisors are concerned that I might be having some kind of breakdown. Jake laughed. Maybe you are. Good kind of breakdown? What do you mean? Maybe you're breaking down the walls between Zephyr sending and Helen. Maybe you're remembering how to be both powerful and human at the same time. Helen considered this. That's a frightening prospect. Why? Because being human means making mistakes. It means being vulnerable, caring too much, letting emotion influence important decisions. Helen's voice carried the weight of centuries of careful control. When your choices affect billions of lives, can you afford to be human? Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. Helen, can you afford not to be?
How many of those billions
of people are suffering because someone forgot they were human too? Helen was quiet for a long time. She spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. More than I want to count. Then maybe it's time to try a different approach. Helen's communicator chimed again, more insistently this time. She looked at it inside. My senior staff is requesting an immediate conference. They're concerned about what they're calling my unusual behavior patterns today. What will you tell them? The truth, I think. That I've had a conversation that reminded me of something important. Helen stood up slowly. Jake, I need to go. Deal with this. But I want you to know that regardless of what my staff thinks, I meant everything I said about our partnership. Jake stood as well. So did I. But Helen, promise me something. What? Don't let them talk you out of being human. Don't let them convince you that caring about individual people makes you weak. Helen reached out and squeezed his hand. I promise. And Jake, yeah, thank you. For seeing Helen instead of just Zephyrin and sending, for caring about whether I'm okay, for reminding me why power exists in the first place. Jake squeezed back. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. For showing me that even the most powerful person in the galaxy needs friends. As Helen turned to leave, Jake called out to her. When will I see you again? She paused and looked back with a smile that was purely Helen, not the carefully controlled expression of a galactic ruler. I'll be back on Luna Station in 3 weeks. Same table? I'll be here. Jake watched as Helen walked away, noting how the few remaining staff members in the café seemed to instinctively step back and bow slightly as she passed. He also noticed the subtle way the air around her shimmered, suggesting the presence of personal shields and other protective technology he couldn't see. But to him, she was still just Helen, a lonely woman who had been carrying too much weight for too long and was finally ready to share that burden with a friend. 3 weeks later, Jake was sitting at their usual table when Helen arrived. She looked different somehow, more relaxed, but also more tired. The gray jumpsuit had been replaced by simple but well-made civilian clothes. How did the meeting with your staff go? Jake asked as she sat down. Better than expected, Helen replied. After I explained my new approach, several of them admitted they'd been worried about some of my previous decisions too, apparently. I'm not the only one who thought I'd become too disconnected from real people, so they're supporting the changes. Most of them. Few are concerned about what they call excessive emotional involvement in policy decisions. Helen smiled. I told them that was exactly the point. Jake grinned. And the results? Are people noticing a difference? Trade disputes that have been dragging on for months are being resolved through mediation instead of economic warfare. Relief supplies are reaching disaster areas faster because I'm prioritizing human need over political considerations. There's a new program providing support for independent operators like yourself who get caught in larger conflicts. Sounds like the galaxy is becoming a more human place. It's a start, Helen agreed. But Jake, I need to tell you something. My staff has created a new position in my organization. They're calling it Special Advisor for Human Perspective. The job description is basically to sit in cafes and have honest conversations with the most powerful being in the galaxy. Jake raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a strange job. Interested? Jake looked out at Earth, then back at Helen. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd received updates about positive changes happening across the galaxy. Trade routes were safer for independent pilots. Diplomatic solutions were replacing military ones. Resources were being directed toward education and disaster relief instead of weapons and surveillance. He thought about Lucy, now secure in her studies, thanks to Helen's scholarship program. He thought about other pilots like himself who would benefit from the new trade protections. He thought about the millions of ordinary people who would live better lives because someone in power had remembered to consider their needs. What's the pay? He asked. Helen laughed, the sound warm and genuine. All the coffee you can drink and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping make the galaxy a better place for regular people. Deal, Jake said, extending his hand across. The table, as they shook hands, Helen smiled. Welcome to the most important job in the galaxy, Jake Martinez. Jake smiled back. Thanks for reminding me that the most important conversations often happen in the most ordinary places. Outside the cafe windows, Earth continued its slow rotation, and across the galaxy, billions of people went about their daily lives unaware that a simple conversation between a cargo pilot and the most powerful being in existence had begun to change their world for the better. The universe had become a little more human. One cafe conversation at a time,